Okay, let's talk about the Enlightenment, the age of reason, which is filled with really smart looking people dressed up in wigs and strange clothes. Okay, it's more than that or less than that, I don't know. Let's try and figure out what it is. So, first off, when is it? Well, here's some little dates to throw at you. The Protestant Reformation, 1517. No, that's not it. The Scientific Revolution, 1540 to 1700. That's building towards it. And then we have the Enlightenment, 1700 to 1800. Now, right off the bat, you should know those are arbitrary dates. It's not like January 1st, 1700, everyone suddenly became enlightened, and December 31st, 1799, they stopped being enlightened. The Enlightenment is a name, a nickname that people at the time, and then later on, gave to this period. And basically what they did is they looked around, they said, okay, something different is happening. Something different than what happened before. We're talking more about ideas. We're reading more books. More is going on intellectually. And if I was going to say what the Enlightenment was, the Enlightenment is kind of a continuation of the scientific revolution. So it makes sense that that's there on the slide. Um, the scientific revolution was guys like Galileo and Isaac Newton challenging the church's worldview. They started off saying that the earth was not the center of the universe. They said that everything went around in the sun, not around the earth. And they went on from there to discover things like, gravity. Basically, the scientists said, we're going to explain the world, not the church. And that was a huge revolution. We call it the scientific revolution for a reason. Well, the Enlightenment sort of took that idea and continued it, but now not just challenging the church's worldview, but also challenging government. Why is government the way it is? What is government for? Now that's a simplification. There's a lot of things going on with the Enlightenment, but that's one of the big themes that I want you to be aware of. All right, why did the Enlightenment happen? Well, it's a lot of reasons. I'll give you two. One is the scientific revolution came first, and that kind of led up to it. So the Enlightenment was building on the thing that came before, but also, well, what it wasn't was just a bunch of people suddenly getting smart and coming up with big ideas, like magic. Look, there is a map showing literacy in Europe in 1500. By the way, that map is kind of bad because it shows modern day European borders. Don't worry about that. The borders didn't look like that back then, but you get the idea. 6% of Britain could sign their name. 7% of France could sign their name. 6% of Germany could sign their name. 9% of Italy, really smart, could sign their name. And that's just sign their name. Could they actually read a book? The percentage was probably lower for reading a book. So that's back in 1500, back at the sort of right in the middle of the Renaissance when things were taking off. If it was the Middle Ages, it would have been even lower. So jump ahead to 1800 and you see how the numbers have changed. 53% of England could sign their name, 37% of France, 68% of Holland could sign their name. So Europe has gotten, well, smarter. And basically Europe has gotten smarter because Europe has gotten richer. Lots of reasons why. One of the big ones is they just learned how to grow more crops. More crops means more people can eat, not starve, which means they can trade extra food for other resources. And basically a bigger percentage of the population could waste their time learning to read. Because, in the Middle Ages, learning to read was pointless. It was farm or die. But when farming got easier and you could make a lot more food, that meant more people could spend some of their time doing something else, like learning to read. All right, well, once you learn to read, you want to do something with that. Because, let's face it, life is a little boring. Why do we invent video games? Because life is a little boring. All right, in the Enlightenment, no video games, so books. So part of why there's an Enlightenment is there's all these people who are learning to read and they want to read something. So writers start to supply the books, supply and demand, economics. If someone's willing to pay money, if I write a book, I'll write a book. And so all these writers started to fill this demand, and you have a whole explosion of literary society, because that's part of what the Enlightenment is about. It's not just a bunch of smart people coming up with new ideas. It's a whole society which is becoming much, much richer, much more literate. And so if you look at the Enlightenment as sort of all these different places where ideas are being discussed, consumed, argued, that maybe give you a better picture of it. So there down the lower left, we have libraries. This is a new development in the 17th and 18th centuries. This one's actually in the 19th century, 1818, but libraries came earlier. And people go in there to get books, because books, even after the printing press, books were pretty expensive. But a library could have all these books, then you would simply pay a fee, because they weren't free, and you could take books out. Libraries, by the way, were not for the poor. Libraries were for people who were middle class or higher, people who could afford to pay that monthly fee to be a member of the library. At the top, you see salons. Now, this is for the really rich people, or the people who are friends with the really rich people. So rich people would invite intellectuals over to their house for a party where they would discuss all the great ideas of the day. And writers and intellectuals would show up at these salons because, well, you know, why do you show up at a gallery opening? Exactly. Free food. So these intellectuals would show up at these salons, and then they would talk about the ideas of the day, and the people who hosted the salons could be around intellectuals, and everyone could feel a lot smarter. And then over on the right side, we see coffee houses, the original Starbucks. Except here, instead of everyone on their computer, everyone is huddled over newspapers talking about them, gossiping. Actually, there's an old expression called coffee housing, where you gossip about something going on. People don't use it much anymore. But coffee houses used to be where a lot of discussions went on. And not just coffee houses, but bars, taverns. Out on the countryside, it was quite common for the local bar to be a place where people gathered to discuss what was going on in the world. And so someone would show up with a newspaper and start talking about what was happening in Paris and what was happening in London. And the local people in the bar might not be able to read, but they could listen to what was going on. And so this whole more vibrant intellectual world was happening everywhere. Generally with the upper classes, and by upper classes I mean middle class, upper class, people who don't have to worry about starving, but some of it even trickled down to the lower levels of society. Okay, so you have the Enlightenment is a place where Europe is getting richer, more people want to read books, writers are producing the books. What are those books about? Well, as I said, there's sort of two main themes. One is continuing to challenge the church, and the other is to challenge the way government works. Now, one of the key figures is a guy named John Locke. And if you want to talk about the Enlightenment, you kind of have to talk about Locke. Now, Locke technically is pre-Enlightenment. He comes before the Enlightenment, but it's all kind of arbitrary. But Locke in 1690 wrote a famous piece of work called the Two Treatises on Government, the Two Essays on Government. Now, the first essay is kind of boring. He just basically criticizes other people he doesn't like and says why they're wrong about government. But the second treatise is where he says, and here's what I think. And what Locke says is government doesn't just exist. Government exists for a reason. And the reason government exists is because without government, life is kind of bad. Now, Locke didn't invent this idea. Back in 1651, 40 years earlier, a guy named Hobbes published something called Leviathan, which is a big book basically saying, again, making the same point as Locke would make, why does government exist? What Hobbes said is that basically without government, men are jerks. And by men, he means people. So without government, we're just going to spend our time beating each other up, stealing our stuff, killing each other, and life is going to be horrible. So we invent government to protect ourselves from basically each other. Now, that's kind of a depressing view, but it was also kind of radical, because before Hobbes, most people argued that government existed basically because God made it. Why is the king? Divine right of kings. God made the king. Hobbes doesn't bring God into it. Hobbes says man made government. And man made government for his own reasons, to protect himself from his own craziness. A little depressing, but very radical. So 40 years later, Locke publishes his essays, and he says, yeah, Hobbes was sort of right, but only sort of. Yeah, life kind of sucks without government. People are kind of bad to each other some of the time. But Locke didn't think it was quite as bad as Hobbes did, because Locke thought that in nature, even without government, man had something. And what he had was natural rights. Locke said we have certain rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the property. And if you were listening, maybe you caught a little echo of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson later on was basically stealing from John Locke. John Locke said we had the right to life, liberty, and stuff, and property. But the problem is, Hobbes is, again, kind of right. Sometimes people try and take our life. Sometimes they try and take our liberty. Sometimes they try and take our stuff. And so we make government to protect our rights. That's the purpose of government. And Locke goes into some more detail about this and what happens when the government does not protect our rights properly. But that is sort of the foundation of a lot of Enlightenment thinking. And so even though John Locke is not an Enlightenment writer, he was incredibly popular among Enlightenment writers. They loved him. Voltaire, Rousseau, all these guys thought well of John Locke. So building on Locke's ideas, you have all these intellectuals in the 18th century, the 1700s, who write various criticisms of the governments of their day. And of course, in most of Europe, the governments of the day are monarchies. Kings run things. And so all these intellectuals keep saying again and again, why? Why do kings run things? Now, mostly, except for a few really radical guys, mostly they don't say, let's get rid of kings. But a lot of them say, maybe kings shouldn't have quite so much power. Maybe we should think about other kinds of systems. And a few of them even start talking about some crazy ideas like democracy. So this is the Enlightenment, and this is why it lays the intellectual foundation for those big revolutions. Well, one little revolution in America and one big revolution in France. I know Americans are always fixated on the American Revolution, but the French Revolution was a much bigger deal. And we're going to talk about that later. All right, so one more thing I want to sort of go over looking at the Enlightenment is the political situation. So we have a Europe where all this intellectual ferment is going on, but there's also Europe which is going more complicated politically. And basically, as Europe is getting richer and more people can read and write, well, European countries, European governments are getting richer. And they're building bigger armies, and they're able to do more with those armies, including a lot of fighting each other. Now, looking at this map here, there are basically 5 major powers that are going to dominate the 18th century. And some of them are going to go into the 19th century. Well, actually, in a way, all of them are. So what are the 5? Well, I'll help you out. Number 1 is France. France is the richest country in Europe. France is the center of intellectual life in Europe. All the cool people go to Paris. France is number 1. Not far after France is Great Britain. Britain has an international trading empire. They've got colonies in the New World. They've got colonies in India. And so Britain is France's main rival. So those are the top 2. The other 3, well, there's the Russian Empire, way off in the east, which is beginning to grow in influence. There's the Austrian Empire, sometimes called the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburgs were the family who ran it. And it was, the Habsburgs were a German family, but it was a multi-ethnic empire. The Habsburgs ruled over different ethnicities. Austrians themselves were basically Germans, but there are also Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenians, you name it. And then the fifth one, the smallest, is the Kingdom of Prussia. And look at this map, they don't look that big really, but they've already built a very effective army, and they've already won a number of wars, and they'll win some wars in the 18th century. And so basically we know with 2020 hindsight that Prussia is going to expand, and eventually, as it absorbs more territory, it's going to get a new name. It's going to be Germany. So France, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Those are the big five. And what does it all mean? Well, we'll talk about that in class. All right. Bye-bye.